Can the government exclude whites on account of their race? Writes Evan over at Forbes, or types Evan over at Forbes. We're going to see what he has to say from the end of the Jim Crow. So right back to the black and white era. Oh, you weren't alive? Well, if you're white, you're still responsible, and we're going to use it as an excuse to victimize you. Do they do the same thing to Japanese children? Do they say, no, now you are going to feel awful for the rest of your life because of something that actual relatives of yours did? Not people hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago, but actual relatives. Jim Crow era, whenever they have to break up the black and white footage to make you to white guilt you, you know that they're stretching. Until very recently, the law has required that the government treat people equally regardless of their race. What? No. Every single law that is passed, interpreted, and applied, as well as every single code, every code of conduct, code in a business, standard at school, rules for organizations. Every single one for 100 years, every single one has been informed by anti-whiteism, which means that we see the law dilated to inflict injury on Western kind and Western civilization, especially those who want to get in the way of the anti-white victimization of our people and civilization. We see the law ignored. So there really is no law, is there? We see the law ignored when it will somehow harm anti-whites, whether they're white or non-white or whatever, victim groups of various types that are anti-white, of course. We see the law ignored, and we see this time and again. The major exception to that has been affirmative action programs. At least he's acknowledging that it's not just a singular thing. But the courts have limited such programs to specific circumstances. No, they have not. And have barred quotas and exclusion. No, they have not. Of any sort. He's lying to you. That's how they work in the anti-white, because they have no morality. Because their morality is to serve the anti-white morality, which means anything goes to arrive at an anti-white conclusion. You all know that by now. There's obviously been governmental discrimination against minorities. Oh, obviously? No, as a matter of fact, there hasn't been shit of discrimination or persecution, Evan. There hasn't been any, as a matter of fact. You can look at every single law, every single code, at every university, at everywhere. There isn't anywhere. That's why you all have to come up with things like institutional racism, because it's not written, it's not being applied, no one is being directly affected. So you have to say it's just in the ether. Evan, that's why you all make up lies like that. So you're starting off with lies. Nothing bad happening to white people, but still bad things happening to non-white people. There has obviously been governmental discrimination against minorities. And remember, we never say minorities because non-white people are not in a precarious situation. White people are in a precarious situation. A tiny minority of the world's population, a minority in almost every single city across the West, and increasingly by, of course, 7 more years or so, 8 more years or so from now, roughly, we're going to be a minority in the United States, and increasingly in other Western countries, numerically minority. Recently, though, the word equity has been replacing equality from the words of President Joe Biden down through lower levels of government. Glad to know that he's at the top. Wonder what the lower levels look like. If Joe, where am I Biden is at the peak, if he's at the acme, then what's the nadir? What's the nadir of that equation? That's a scary thought. Equity means that to fight systemic racism, there you go right there. Now he's taken it as a premise. You never allow them. You say, bravo, Sierra. There's no such thing. You cannot prove it. That is just an anti-white. It's just a mean pathogen. It's an anti-white slur. And since you can't prove it, it's just one of your superstitions. I utterly reject it. Systemic racism. Discrimination against privileged groups such as whites. Privileged groups such as whites. So now Evan's trying to make it seem like, oh, it's more people than just white people that are out there being harmed. Bravo, Sierra, Evan. Everyone knows white people are the only race that you can legally and morally discriminate and persecute against in the totality of the West. So he's trying to diminish our persecution, our suffering, by saying we are one of many groups that are just suffer. What a piece of shit Evan is. Just my opinion. As America's most oft-cited critical race theorist, Ibram Kendi, whose work is widely assigned in schools and higher education, puts it, quote, the only remedy to racist, of course, that's heresy to anti-whiteism, discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. So you get that anti-racist. So anti-racist is a code word for anti-white. Every time you hear that, anti-racist is a code word for anti-white, and you shut them right down. You stay in our story. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination against white people. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination against white people. I'm just finishing what that piece of dirt is actually thinking. As 3 recent examples show, it means that government should sometimes exclude whites on account of their race. Well, maybe Evan thinks that we're not going to be able to remember the previous paragraph where he reduced our persecution to being one of many groups. But now he says in application, it's white people. He attempts to diminish it again at this time in this sentence, dumbass Evan, by saying sometimes. That's why it's coast to coast, north to south, Western country to Western country, because it's sometimes happening. One relatively minor example of this occurred. I mean, look at all of the ways this guy continues to try to couch what's happening to us. This piece of dirt would write this way because he's anti-white about what's happening to us in South Africa. One minor example is when scores of white people were ritualistically raped and murdered in front of their loved ones on their kitchen tables. That's a minor example, isn't it, Evan? When they start coming for the white people, let it please God, let it be these anti-white white people out there whose homes they get to first, not ours. I don't want anybody getting harmed, but the anti-whites, they're marching. They marched all during the summer, so they're marching. One minor example of this occurred when, it's a public school district in Massachusetts, all right, so Wesley Public School District, excluded white students from a, quote, healing space after the March shooting that killed 8 people, including 6 Asian Americans. Were white people killed? He mentions that some non-white people were killed. Does anybody know, were white people killed? Do they not matter? The email announcing the event read, quote, note, this is a safe space for our Asian American and students of color. So, of course, Asians are non-white. People of color excludes white people from mankind. So then it says not, with like little stars around it, for students who identify only as white. So, of course, they have the last say on whether or not you are properly identifying. Because if you waltz in there, like if I were to waltz in there as fair-skinned as I am, and Germanic face that I have, and I just say, I feel like I'm identifying as whatever today, then they're going to say, sure, come in. You're identifying as whatever today. Just please sit among us. Hate white people with us. You know, they'll say, you're not allowed. The school district was obviously well-intentioned. Anti-whites. They're obviously well-intentioned. Here we go. Revealing again. Evan, well done, you perfectly stolid dumbass. They were well-intentioned and were trying to create space where students, I guess whites aren't students, who see themselves as groups subject to hate crimes. Oh, okay. They see themselves as groups subject to hate crimes. But white people, white students, they're not allowed to see themselves as subjected to hate crimes, could get together to support one another. But even this minor, well-intentioned, the cherubs were at work. Their little wingies were just fluttering all day long. And then they got hit with, I don't know, raid or something. And because they were thought to be mosquitoes, but they weren't. They were cherubs. Fortunately, CNN was there to revive every single one of them. But even this minor, well-intentioned exclusion is harmful, he types drunkenly. I can even see a little bit of the puke in the words. For example, oh my gosh. For example, Jews who are mostly white in America. Here's some news, Evan. Jews are not white. They are a very specific people. There's a country where if you're a Jew, you can go live there. As a mostly Germanic descended white man, man of the West, I can't get a citizenship there because I'm not a Jew. So that means that they are a distinct people. They're not mostly white. They're not white at all. But of course, Evan was drunk and obviously also high on PCP and bath salts. He types on, are subjected to more hate crimes per capita than either Asian Americans or blacks. So what Evan is saying here in his stupor is that Jewish people, and I'm not digging into any data. Nobody should be victimized on the basis of an immutable characteristics, including white people. No one, including white people. What he's saying here is that Jews are, now that is actually a curious statement, since there are far more blacks and Asians than there are Jews. I mean, that would, for more Jewish people to be subjected to crimes that are driven by their Jewishness, that would mean that, that would be a massive, how could that be possible? I don't know. I don't care. I'm sure CNN knows, but it seems like a strange thing to say, given the overall number of Jewish people in the country. But again, no one, not Jewish people, not black people, not Asian people, not white people, should be victimized at all, period. There should be no victimization, but certainly not on the basis of an immutable characteristic. He types on, in fact, anti-Semitic, okay, so he can say anti-Semitic, so we can say anti-white. Hate crimes against Jewish students, isn't that redundant? He writes for Forbes, he types for Forbes, but again, he was on bath salts, so that makes sense. Students are at an all-time high, he says. If that's true, that's wretched, and it should end immediately. So excluding them from a public school group that is supposed to help students deal with the trauma of hate crimes is anti-Semitic in effect, if not in intent. Okay, so now we just get the thrust of what this anti-white filth just said. Excluding white people from things might end up excluding non-white people like Jews, and therefore it's wrong. Now, if it can exclude white people without excluding non-white people like Jews, then it's okay. Now you see what Evan is getting at, don't you? Now you see why he's alone and lives in a trash can like Oscar the Grouch and uses bath salts, because that's what he's worried about. Similar issues are presented regarding white LGBTQ and other excluded students who suffer disproportionately from hate crimes. Okay, so as long, according to Evan, you just saw this here. He writes for Forbes. I'm sure he has a six-figure salary. This is the regime's media writing to white people out there in the world, a lot of them older, a lot of them wealthier, a lot of them hoping they'll be wealthier, all of them prigs who think they're better than everyone else, with their noses in the air, and they're going to think, I read from Forbes, and so therefore I'm so much better than those white people over there with the big truck. But of course, they come to the white people with the big truck. Can you fix my car? It's not running again. Can you do the furnace and everything's on fire in the house? Can you call 911, dumbass? Call 911. That's what oh, okay, thank you. It didn't say so in Forbes, though. These are the kind of people that Evan is writing to. And what he has just told them, and what they will now say to you, because they don't get a thought of their own in their head, they're just getting it from Evan, who writes for Forbes, anti-white publication. They're going to say, you know what? The reason why these groups that exclude white people might be bad is because they might end up excluding white people who are part of victim groups like LGBTQ or Jews who look like they're white people. Just like, remember the professor out there on the West Coast, and it was a no white people get to come to college day, no white people, and the Jewish professor shows up and they're like, "What? Get the hell out of here!" And he's like, "What are you talking about? I'm a Jew," he says. And they say, "What? So you're going to get out?" They got a little overzealous that day. They were just going on the pigmentation. So that's what these people are saying. They're saying that if you can just really narrow this down to white male and maybe some of the white females who are straight and preferably who are Christian, Catholic, then good. Yes, then you can do this. Then you can persecute and discriminate. But if you are not really tight on those rules, if you're not really carefully looking at things, you might end up harming some good people out there. What do you think about Evan now?